Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, everybody. Oh, I can hardly believe the week is about over. I feel like I'm just getting to know many of you. And I heard, I wasn't here for his announcement, but I understand Ben told you that I'm looking for Facebook friends. I don't know how he said that, but I hope it... I have a friendly competition with a friend in Pennsylvania on our numbers. I'm actually about 150 ahead of him. But how many of you are on Facebook? Oh. Well, you could push me over 1,000 because I'm about 960. So anyway, I'd love to connect on Facebook with you. As late as mid-January, I kept telling people, "What is this Facebook? Why would I want to do? You know, am I going to get 1 million emails?" I mean, I didn't even know what it was, and now I'm addicted, just like most of you. So, well, I know it's customary for most, if not all, of our speakers, and for me as well, to lecture more from notes and be more spontaneous in delivery. But this being the final lecture, I have a kind of a combination of spontaneous stuff and some prepared lectures. So I hope you'll bear with me during the parts where I will perhaps sound like I'm reading to you, but I want to get it right because this is our final send-off lecture, and I think it deals with a very, very important subject. In fact, I would argue that this subject is very much a big picture one at a time when Americans are absorbed with small picture stuff, like the financial crisis. And you may be shocked to hear that I would refer to this calamitous financial crisis as a small picture thing, but I believe it really is, and that there are far more important things, and in fact the financial crisis itself is due in great measure to some more deeply rooted fundamental problems that if we don't fix are going to lead to even greater difficulties in the future. Another way to put it is that Americans today are focused on some trees, but they're missing the forest. And one tree is the housing bust, another tree is the financial crisis, another tree is how Congress is responding to it, the trillions of dollars of deficit spending and bailouts. So these are all big trees, but there's something much more important. There's a blight on the forest, a blight on the forest, and if we leave it unaddressed, if we spend our time absorbed with the individual trees that capture our attention for the moment and ignore the forest, we're in for a lot of trouble in the future. And I'm talking about character. We've learned a lot of economics this week. I want to talk to you today about something that I think is at the very foundation of living freely in a free and civil society, something we could not do without, and that is the importance, that is character and its critical importance. Let me share with you some results from a recent survey, and I'd be interested if you think this is far off the mark or if in your experience you've seen something similar. It's a testimony, if it's accurate, to an erosion of character in American society. And although it deals with young people, I don't want you to think for a moment that I'm singling out young people because I think the same trends are in place with the older generations too. This comes from the Josephson Institute of Ethics, and they do this survey every 2 years of high school students, males and females across the country, tens of thousands of them, and here's what they found. More than 1 in 3 males, about 35%, and 1/4 of the girls, 26%, total of about 30% overall, the entire high school population, admitted stealing from a store within the past year. Students who attend private, secular, and religious schools were less likely to steal than the traditional public school population, but the theft rate among non-religious independent school students was more than 1 in 5. Well, 19% who attend religious schools also admitted to stealing something from a store within the past year. Honors students, 21%. Student leaders, 24%. And students involved in youth activities like the YMCA and school service clubs, 27%, were less likely to steal, but still more than 1 in 5 committed theft. In the area of, here's another statistic on stealing. 23% said they stole something from a parent or a relative, and 20% confessed they stole something from a friend within the previous year. When it comes to lying, more than 2 of 5, 42%, said that they sometimes lie to save money. 39% of students in private religious schools admitted to lying, as did 35% of the students attending private non-religious schools. How about cheating? Cheating in schools continues to be rampant, and it's getting worse. And this has been the case in all the years, some 20 years or more, that this survey has been conducted. A substantial majority, 64%, cheated on a test during the past year, up from 60% in 2006. No gender differences on the issue of cheating on exams. As bad as these numbers, and there were more in this survey, seem to be, they may understate the level of dishonesty exhibited these days. More than 1 in 4, get this, more than 1 in 4, 26% confessed that they had lied on at least 1 or 2 questions on the survey. No kidding. So, now despite these high levels of dishonesty, the respondents have a high self-image when it comes to ethics. A whopping 93% said that they were, quote, satisfied with their personal ethics and character. 77% said that when it comes to doing what's right, quote, I'm better than most people I know. So that's just one small possible indicator of something that does concern me increasingly, the erosion of character in so many ways. And we use this term character in a lot of different ways. Some people have character, some people are characters, and some of those characters don't have character. But I'm using the term today in its most positive sense, referring to certain traits of personality that I think all of us, or virtually all of us, would say, yeah, even if I don't fully measure up, if I have failings in some of those areas myself, I still recognize that it would be great if more people lived by these standards of character, if more people exhibited these kinds of traits. So I think we generally know what it is. And in a very positive sense, I'm referring to those traits that most of us would acknowledge are the kinds of things that are important to live, if we're living in a society where you can trust people and where people can trust you. Your character, I should tell you, by the way, I'm referring to moral principles, which are so vital to the maintenance of a free economy. And I constantly lament the shortage of moral principles in our elected leaders. There, I think you see time and again the willingness to use the force of government to steal from some and give to others is a moral question. And so many of them are afraid to stand up on behalf of what they know to be right, if they in fact know what is right. I'm not referring to that attitude of, say, Groucho Marx, who, by the way, was a great comedian. I love Groucho Marx, but he displayed an interesting attitude on this matter of principle in one of his movies, in which he plays the leader of a fictitious country, and he's giving a speech, and he says to people, those are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. In other words, I really don't have any. I'll have whatever you want me to have if it serves my ends. Your character is not defined by what you believe or what you say you believe in. Talk is cheap. It's defined, in fact, by the actual choices that you make, especially the choices in tough situations. You know, in easy situations, making easy choices, that may not say a whole lot about your character, but in challenging, difficult circumstances, when your principles are on the line, when much is at stake, it's those moments that decide where your character is, how deeply it's sound and how deeply it's rooted. If you were to add up, if you could do this in some fashion, being an Austrian, I recognize you can't quantify these things, but if you could somehow magically add up all of your choices in life, they would roughly equal your character. They tell you a lot. They would tell anyone a great deal about what kind of character you are. If you say you're honest, but you often cut corners or lie or prevaricate or steal whenever you think you can get away with it, then you've subtracted substantially from your character, in spite of what you may say. Now, this is critical to freedom. Critical. I think it's indispensable to understand this as advocates of freedom. In the larger scheme of things, history shows us time and time again that a people who will not exert strong character as individuals, a people who will sacrifice character for expediency, become a people like putty in the hands of tyrants and demagogues. They can be bought and paid for, they can be swayed by demagoguery, they can be sold a bill of goods because their baser motives rise to the fore, and tyrants and demagogues are more than happy to cater to them to advance their own self-interest. Another way to put this is self-government that we often use in a political sense, meaning, you know, whatever government you have some say in it, as opposed to dictatorship. We elevate that principle as far superior to dictatorship. But self-government in the political sense really begins with true self-government. That is, you governing yourself. Because history shows us that if you do not govern yourself, sooner or later, you will be governed. Somebody will be happy to come in and knock heads together, bring order out of the chaos, and impose their will on a disorderly, chaotic, unprincipled, characterless society. 20 years ago, something quite remarkable happened in a little town in Georgia called Conyers. Anybody ever been there by chance? Conyers, Georgia. Oh, you have? Oh, that's right, Carly, you're from Georgia. You know where it is. Okay. Well, this actually happened in this little town, and I've referred to it a million times since because I think it was a wonderful testimony to character. When school officials there discovered that one of their basketball players, who had played 45 seconds in the first of the school's 5 postseason games, had actually been scholastically ineligible, they returned the state championship trophy that they had won just a few weeks before. If they had simply kept quiet, never revealed this, no one else would probably ever have known about it, and they could have kept the trophy. But to their eternal credit, the town and the team, dejected though they were when the news began to get around, they rallied behind the school's decision. And here's what the coach said. "We didn't know he was ineligible at the time, but you've got to do what's honest and right and what the rules say. I told my team that people forget the scores of the games, but they don't ever forget what you're made of." In the minds of most in that little town, it didn't matter that the championship title had been forfeited. The coach and the team were still champions in more ways than one. And I often wonder how many times, or how many audiences that I speak to, could you have the great majority of people say, yeah, I would have done that too? I don't know. I have a sense it might be fewer today than 20 years ago, but I could be wrong. I don't have a way to quantify that. But here's something I told graduates recently at a commencement address, and I don't know that I could say it differently that's in a way that's better, so I'm just going to read this paragraph to you. I told them that I wanted to talk to them about one thing that's more important than all the good grades they've ever earned, more important than all the high school and college degrees they'll accumulate, and indeed more important than all the knowledge that they, or to make it more personal, you will absorb in your lifetimes. This is something that's so important. It's something over which every responsible adult, every responsible thinking adult has total personal control over. And yet every day all across this country there are countless people who sacrifice this for very, very little. What I'm talking about will not only define and shape your future, it will put either a concrete floor or an iron ceiling over it. It's what the world will remember you for, probably more than anything else. It's not your looks, it's not your talents, it's not your ethnicity, and ultimately it may not even be anything you ever say. And this incredibly powerful thing is character. When a person spurns his conscience and fails to do what he knows is right, he subtracts from his character. When he evades his responsibilities and succumbs to temptation, foists his problems and burdens on others, or fails to exert self-discipline, he subtracts from his character. When he is so self-absorbed that he ceases to be of service to others unless there's something in it for him, he subtracts from his character. When he attempts to reform the world without reforming himself first, he subtracts from his character. Well, what are the elements of strong character? I want to zero in on some of them. I'm sure you could all name a whole lot of them, much more than I've got on my list here, but I just want to say a few things about the ones I think are among the most important. I'll give you them in a list form first, and then I'll come back and talk about many of them. These are the elements I think are critical to strong character. They define strong character. Honesty, humility, responsibility, honesty, humility, responsibility, principle, self-discipline, courage, self-reliance, optimism, and a long-term focus. Let me read those again for you. Honesty, humility, responsibility, principle, self-discipline, courage, self-reliance, optimism, and a long-term focus. I don't think that a free society is possible without a very heavy dose from the great majority of people of most, if not all, of those important character traits. Think of it this way. Dishonest people, just the opposite of honesty. Dishonest people will lie, they'll cheat, they'll become even bigger liars and cheaters in elected office. There's nothing about going to government that suddenly makes you more honest than the folks who sent you there. In fact, the incentives within government are very strongly to push people in the other direction. It takes a very strong person to go to government and maintain solid, honest principles. People who lack humility become arrogant, condescending, central planner types who think that they know how to plan the lives of everybody else. Irresponsible citizens who don't measure up to standards of responsibility, what do? They tend to blame the consequences of their own poor judgment on everybody else, expecting others to give them a living. People who don't discipline themselves and who thereby intrude on others invite the intrusive control from other people or from governments. And those who eschew self-reliance become easily manipulated by those on whom they become dependent. And pessimists, you might have wondered, what does optimism have to do with strong character? Well, pessimists, just the opposite, they dismiss what free people can accomplish when left alone and given the freedom to try. And they become often the controlling type who feel like they've got to plunge in and run your life because you probably will fail if they don't. Short-sighted citizens who don't have a long-term focus will mortgage the future not only of themselves and their children but all of society for the sake of a short-term solution. They'll be putty in the hands of demagogues who come along and say, we can do something for you now, we can give you something today, and we'll send the bill to the next generation. It's far-sighted people that think, wait a minute, we can't think of only the here and now, and we cannot think of only ourselves. We've got to think of the long term and of all people. Let me give you an example. There are endless examples we could give about how we pay an awful price for the erosion of character, but I'll give you a very mundane one. because I know you've all experienced this. You've all bought an electronic device, like at Best Buy, an iPod or something. It comes in these incredible plastic fortresses that you have to get the pinking shears out to cut into and try. Why do you think manufacturers put stuff in those things? It's to deter theft. So every time I grapple with one of those things, I think of it in terms of I am paying a character premium. In a society of honest people, manufacturers wouldn't feel such a compulsion to put those things in that stuff. But we're paying for that, and it is a premium that stems from an erosion of character. I want to focus on some of these character traits because bad character leads to bad economics, and bad economics is very bad for liberty. No question about it. Ultimately, whether we live free and in harmony with the rules of human nature and the laws of economics, or whether we stumble in the dark of serfdom, is not so much a political issue, it's not so much an economic issue as it is a character issue. It really is a character issue more than anything else. People of strong character don't do a lot of the things that are leading to our troubles today. They don't vote for the politicians who give them what they're giving. It's an evidence, this financial crisis is just one manifestation of an erosion of character among the American people. So let me talk about some of these character traits. And I think the best way to educate or to instill or inspire people with good ideas is through stories. So I'm going to talk about these traits with some stories. Some come from people I know or have known, others from people I never met, except through the pages of history. Honesty, I told you, was the first one. Let me tell you this story. One of these things that happened 20 years ago this August, but I'll never forget it. And I'll always regret the fact that I didn't try to get this gentleman's contact information so I could stay in touch with him. This was August of 1989. I went to Cambodia with a very good friend of mine. How many of you have seen the movie The Killing Fields? Okay, that's a true story. And the man who played the role of Dith Pran in the film, the major character of the movie, Dr. Hang Nor, was himself an escapee from communist dictatorship under the Khmer Rouge. 10 years before he had escaped, having endured the most incredible brutality firsthand in that 3.5 years of communist dictatorship. During that time, by the way, out of a population of 8 million, nearly 2 million Cambodians died through execution, through famine. This was the most brutal egalitarian dictatorship ever. I mean, they were going to make everybody equal. And 1/4 of the population vanished in 3.5 years. So Dr. Noor went through this, comes to America, stars in this film, first role he ever played in a movie. He was a physician by training, but because he was portraying real life and he wanted the world to know of what his country had gone through, he really performed magnificently. So I got to know him after the film was made, and he asked me in 1989 to go back to Cambodia with him. It was his first visit to his native land in 10 years since he had escaped. Things had changed enough, he felt it was safe to go back, and so he and I and a group from ABC News went back and spent a couple weeks there. And in my little town of Midland, Michigan beforehand, there were some stories about this forthcoming trip. And because I wanted to rustle up some medical supplies to take back with me, and the local hospital donated a lot. And a woman one day called from a local church, and she said, "I see you're going to Cambodia. We at our church helped several Cambodian families several years ago when they, as refugees, came to America fleeing the communist dictatorship. And they would love for you to take letters and some money back to their relatives if you can find them in Cambodia." There were 3 families. I had 3 envelopes with letters and cash in each one. And I was given their addresses. And the mail was so unreliable. Their contact with their families back home was very intermittent. And it was so tough to send cash because mail would be open and the cash would be taken. They thought this might be one of the few chances where they'd be pretty sure to get something through, because I could personally deliver them. Well, 2 of the families I had to find were in Phnom Penh, the capital, so they were easy to find. The third was way out in a town called Battambang. Not easy to get to. There was still fighting in the countryside. But I was told, family in Battambang, here's an envelope for them. In addition to the letters inside, there's $200 in here for this family, but don't come back with the money. If you can't get out there, there's too many people in Cambodia who could put this to good use. Find somebody, anybody, to leave the money with. Don't come back with it. So it was the last day of my visit in Phnom Penh, and I realized I was not going to get to Battambang. Who do I give this money to? There was a gentleman, one among several, who would come up to the hotel every morning trying to give people a ride in his little rickshaw type thing. He always had a smile. He seemed friendly. He had some broken English. We communicated briefly. I didn't know anything but a first name. And I just decided at the last minute, I'm going to give it to him. I know he could put it to good use, but I'm going to see if maybe I could get him to take the bulk of it out to that family. So I told him, if you can get this to Battambang, keep $50 of it, just for the trouble of getting there. And I thought, we'll never know, never hear anything, and I got on a plane, came home. A few months later, the same woman who had called me before my trip called all excited. She said, the family that was related to the ones in Battambang got a letter from their folks, and they've shared it with me. I want to read to you this paragraph. And the paragraph read, "Thank you for sending the $200. That man had not only not kept the 50 I offered him, this guy didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. He went to the trouble, and some expense, I'm sure, to go out there and deliver that, and must have felt that this was intended for them. I'm going to give it all to them." And I've thought over the years, if I had to trust my life to him, not knowing anything else about him, I think I probably would. Doesn't that say an awful lot about somebody who would do that? I'll never forget that. That's a standard of honesty and faithfulness that we would do well to live up to, even partially. The second trait I want to give you a story about is humility. Humility. The story I want to tell you here is about a man I've come to know who just celebrated his 100th birthday about 2 weeks ago, the 18th of May. His name is Nicholas Winton. Have any of you ever heard of him? Okay, good. This is on our website, so I was hoping you hadn't seen it yet or read it. But Nicky Winton, Ben Stafford and I got to know him about 4 years ago. You may find this hard to believe, but there is in fact an Emmy Award-winning documentary produced about him and what he did. So there's no exaggeration here, whatever. This man was 29 years of age in 1938. He was a stockbroker in Britain, and he was planning to go on a vacation in Switzerland at Christmas time. Now, you know from your history what 1938 was on the eve of. These were challenging times. Hitler was on the march. World War II was a year away from breaking out, but he was taking chunks of Europe. In the fall of 1938, the issue was Czechoslovakia, and there was a big agreement at Munich where the Western powers basically said to him, okay, you can take a big chunk of Czechoslovakia, we won't do anything, it's yours. And he marched into the Sudetenland, the border area around the perimeter of Czechoslovakia, and occupied it. But he had his eyes on the rest of Czechoslovakia as well as Europe as well. But what was Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, saying at the time after the Munich Agreement, his famous line?
Is it peace for all time?
Peace in our time. You know, we've given him what he wanted, now we have peace. And of course we're a year away from the outbreak of World War II because Hitler wasn't going to stop there. Well, Nicky Winton is about to go in December of that year to Switzerland for a Christmas vacation. He gets a call from a friend in the British Embassy in Prague, Czechoslovakia, who tells him, don't go to Switzerland, come here instead, there's something I must show you. And he was persuasive enough that Nicky changed his plans. He went to Prague, and what his friend wanted to show him were these makeshift, ramshackle refugee camps in the middle of winter, housing mostly Czech, but also from Poland and southern Germany, Jewish families who had fled Hitler. They knew that he was on the march, that that they were in harm's way. They and their children were living in these freezing camps, trying to get out, but not able to get visas to go anyplace. No, all the countries of the world thought, well, we don't want to offend Hitler by, in effect, agreeing with these people that they're in danger, so no, they got to stay there. So Nicky goes to these camps and he sees these parents pleading with him, if we can't get out, at least will you help us get our children out? And, much of the world was saying, what's the problem? We just signed a peace agreement, no trouble here. But Nicky Winton knew what might be coming. And so, and he felt so touched by what he saw that he decided he was going to try to do something about it. He wrote letters to governments all over the world saying, if I can get the children out, will you at least allow them to come into your country? Only 2 governments in the world said yes. And I'm sad to say ours was not one of them. Only Britain and Sweden said yes, we would accept them. But they had conditions. His own country, Britain, said, yeah, you can bring them, but, this may blow over rather quickly, and then they're going to have to go back, and we don't want to get stuck with a tab, so you got to raise some money, the equivalent of $3,500 in today's money for every child he brought in. He had to go find to raise. So the Home Office would say, okay, you can bring them here. He had to find foster families to place them with all across Britain, plus a few in Sweden. And he had to arrange the rail transports to get them out and do the paperwork and so forth. And he gets this organized group of volunteers together to do this. They end up over the spring and into the summer of 1939 arranging 9 rail transports full of children. And you can in this documentary, you actually see some of the scenes at Railside where the parents are there and they're having to say goodbye to their children, wondering if they'll ever see them again, but wanting to get them to safety. Very tearful occasion. And in fact, almost none of the children he got out ever did see their parents again. Because when war broke out and Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, the Jewish families, most of them were sent to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and places like that. In fact, one reason why Nicky could hardly talk about this for many years was that the largest of all the transports he had arranged, he had foster families all lined up for them in Britain, had 250 kids on the train on September 1, 1939. That's the day that war broke out. It's the only one of the transports he arranged that never left the station. The Nazis stopped all transports, and every single one of those children was sent to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. None of them survived. But he got 669 children out. Well, you might be saying, well, okay, what's the story? Where's the humility connection here? He did this quietly, behind the scenes, and of course he didn't stay in touch with the children. I mean, there was no need to. He placed them safely in foster families. He goes off to join the Royal Air Force. He's in the Air Force for 6 years. Later meets a woman who will become his wife. He never even tells her what he had done. 50 years later, with all these children now in their late 50s and 60s, all across Britain and elsewhere, a lot of them have moved to various places, some back to Czechoslovakia looking for their parents after the war, so forth. None of them knowing who was it that got us out. Who was the person who arranged all of this? Some of them looking for half a century, trying to find who set all this up. 50 years later, 1988, Mrs. Winton is going through their attic and comes across this box that Nicky had put up there a long time before. She finds a scrapbook with children's pictures in it and visa document stuff and all kinds of things related to this period. She wants to know, what is all this stuff? So for the first time in half a century, he tells her what he had done. And she starts telling others, word gets out, and there's this TV show in Britain. If you ever see this documentary, there's a clip from that show in 1988 called That's Life, where they would bring in a guest, tell some remarkable story about them, and then surprise them with long-lost relatives or something like that. We've had programs like that here. And so Nicky is invited to come to a TV studio for taping of this show, and he knows that that they've got the story, but what he doesn't know is that they went through the list that was in the scrapbook of all the children, trying to find, going back to where they were placed in Britain, trying to find them, and they found nearly 400 of them still alive. And so you see this clip in the show where he's sitting there in the front row, and the host is telling the story of saving all these children, pointing out that there are 5,000 plus people alive today because of what he did when you count the children, their grandchildren. One of them is even a member of parliament, no less. And then the host says, might there be someone in this audience who had been among the children, who were among the children that Nicky saved 50 years ago? Well, everybody in the audience stands. And he turns around and he sees all these children now in their 60s, 70s, that he saved 50 years before. And that was 20 years ago. Here he is now. They just had a huge celebration for him in Prague and in London. He's been knighted by Queen Elizabeth. He is now Sir Nicholas Winton. At 100 years of age, he still drives. Just a remarkable guy, sharp, recipient of awards from all over the world, but always maintaining an incredible humility. When Ben and I met with him and interviewed him, and you can see the results of this interview if you type in his name on our website, Nicholas Winton, W-I-N-T-O-N. We kept saying, Nicky, you're such a hero. And he would say, no, I'm not a hero. I did what any decent person should have done. Don't call me a hero. He gets called in the papers Britain's Schindler. And he says, he just does not want to be elevated. He says, this is decency anyone should have done. That's all I did. That's the best example of humility I know. A guy who is deserving of enormous praise and honor and yet doesn't seek it. He did the right thing not for fame or fortune. Those were the furthest thing from his mind. But because it was the right thing to do. Wouldn't it be a wonderful world if people did what they knew to be right, whether it profited them or not? If they did the right thing, irrespective of prospects for fame or fortune. If they did the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. How rare that is. Another element in character is, I mentioned, principle. Principle. And this might sound a little out of place because it's, principles can be good or bad. And what I'm suggesting here is you need to stand for something in life. You need to believe in something with a passion, something you are convinced is so right that you're going to stand by it, you're going to defend it, you're going to spread the word of it, you're going to pass it on to the next generation. This is what it means to be principled. You're going to judge your actions and those of others by the standards of principle you establish. It seems to me, if any of you are planning to go into elective office, let me tell you, you'll make your life as an elected official so much easier if you believe in principle. I've often thought if I ran once myself but lost. No regrets for running, no regrets for losing. But I've often thought if I had won, how easy it would have been to be a public official. Because the reason is, I know where I stand. And there'd be a whole lot of meetings I wouldn't have to have. If the teacher union calls and says, hey, we want to meet with you because we're concerned about your support of choice in schooling, I would say, hey, that's a moral right. You're not changing my mind. If you want to talk about that, we don't need a meeting. That'd save a lot of time. Having principle just defines and clarifies things so beautifully. Take the financial crisis today. If you were in government, you would be beset with all kinds of arguments from people saying, we got to do something like this. It's a terrible time and this requires drastic action. And you might be wondering, should we do it, should we not? For me, it would be awfully easy on these issues of, say, bailouts and deficits. Very easy, just based from principle. I would ask this question. If I took $1 from any of you and gave it to somebody else because they wanted it, There's something inherently wrong about that, right? Not knowing anything else, you kind of have to be a little bit, if you have some moral value, you'd have to say, wait a minute, wasn't it mine? And why are you doing that? Well, if I were to take $1 from the innocent and give to the guilty, or from the irresponsible, or from the responsible, and give to the irresponsible, we should be bothered by that, right? Is there anything about doing that 1 trillion times that makes it right? If you just do enough of it on a grand enough scale, is there some threshold at which that suddenly becomes right because you've done it a lot of times? Or are you just simply 1 trillion times more wrong? Well, if you have some strong moral principle, you would say it's just wrong. It's just wrong. It's wrong when you do it one at a time, and it's wrong to do it 1 trillion at a time. So that's easy. Bailouts, they're wrong. And then you can talk the economics of it if you want. But from a moral standpoint, there isn't some level of doing it at which it becomes right because it's of such a magnitude. My favorite example of a person of principle is my favorite president of the United States, Grover Cleveland. That's another lecture altogether, but I'm going to condense it. But what I like about Grover Cleveland, our 22nd and 24th president, was the fact that he almost always came to the right policy conclusion, not because he was an economist, not because he studied economics, he didn't have a college degree, but because of his moral principles. He was raised to understand the critical necessity of being honest in all your dealings, to be a person of your word, to make your word your bond. That was so deeply ingrained in him, honesty, humility, and these other principles I've talked about. That's how he saw the world. So, he was, one of the big issues of his day was the tariff. He was a free trader. You know why? He didn't read Adam Smith. He didn't go to economics seminars. He wasn't from a think tank. He was for free trade because he said, when you go to the government and ask for protection against your competition, asking government to use force to stick it to your competition, that's just wrong. It's wrong. So I'm opposed to that. It's just not a good, and somebody's convenience or somebody's, I'll make more money if you do that for me. That doesn't mean that it's right. It's just fundamentally wrong. So he was for sound money. Why? Because unsound money was theft. Unsound money stole from people. So he was opposed to paper inflation. He opposed the welfare state. In fact, he vetoed more bills than all the previous 21 presidents combined. And to this day holds the number 2 spot as vetoing more bills than anybody else but one president. And in one of his vetoes of a bill that would have given 10,000 federal dollars to drought-stricken farmers in Texas, disaster relief, he vetoed it. Just $10,000, which in today's money would be about $2 million. He vetoed it, and here's what he said in his veto. Though the people may support the government, it's not the duty of the government to support the people. And he goes on, I paraphrase now, but he says, in times of distress, we must rely upon the charity of our fellow countrymen, lest we become dependent upon political authorities for our sustenance. How prophetic. Barely 100 years ago, and he was a Democrat, no less. My colleague, Bert Folsom, a former colleague, a very, very good friend from Hillsdale College, he and I discovered in 1995 that Grover Cleveland's son was still living. He was 92 years of age and still sharp as a tack. He was born when his father, Grover, was 67, and after they left the White House. And we spent an evening with him up in New Hampshire where he lived. But that's another lecture. But Grover Cleveland was a man of principle whose principles helped him reach the right ultimate conclusions in area after area where he had no expertise. But he had principle that helped guide him to the right conclusion. Courage. Where are we on time, by the way? Have I gone an hour yet?
No.
Oh, okay. I am winding up here. Okay. I'll wind up here shortly. Courage. Oh, how I wish we had more of that, of people who are willing to take risk on behalf of the right ideas. And one of the best examples I know is of a man named Thomas Clarkson. How many of you have heard of him before? Did you see the movie Amazing Grace? Any of you? Okay. I recommend it. It's about William Wilberforce, the man in Parliament who led the effort against the slave trade in Great Britain in the 1780s, 90s, and early part of the 19th century. But Clarkson plays a prominent role as Wilberforce's right-hand man. In fact, I'm convinced from my reading that maybe Clarkson deserves a little more credit for this ultimate success against slavery than even Wilberforce. Wilberforce gets all the attention, and of course, being in Parliament, it carries some weight and the command of the media. But Clarkson was the guy behind the scenes who was running all over Britain. In fact, in 20 years, from 1787 until 1807, when they finally won the first big vote in Parliament, Thomas Clarkson rode 35,000 miles on horseback all over Great Britain, rustling up signatures on petitions, collecting evidence, conducting interviews and collecting testimony from people who had witnessed slavery or life on a slave ship firsthand. He created the world's first think tank in 1787. It was 12 people sitting around a table in a print shop in London. And if you ever go to London, let me know, because I'll tell you some of the monuments you must see pertaining to this era and to Clarkson in particular. But he gets 12 people, most of them Quakers, sitting around a print shop. I get so excited, I get carried away. In London, and he says, we've got to change the world. And think of how unbelievably insurmountable it must have seemed in 1787 to say, we're going to get Great Britain to end the slave trade and slavery itself. I mean, lots of people were making money off of it. And it wasn't really occurring around Britain, so you couldn't see it. It was something occurring in the West Indies, but British slave ship captains were making lots of money, and other industrialists and so forth. And this was something that had been going on for centuries all over the world. Slavery was an age-old institution. People believed widely that it's just sort of the natural order of things. We underestimate, I think, what a wonderful victory this was for liberty only within the last couple hundred years, that an institution as cruel and brutal and as prevalent as slavery could actually be virtually extinguished. It looked like a tall order in 1787, but Thomas Clarkson was a student at Cambridge University in the mid-1780s, and one year there was a professor there who was always in charge of this famous essay contest every year, and you had to submit your essays in Latin. And he would select a topic that contestants would write about, and this guy was touched by what he had learned shortly before about slavery. So he decides, I'm going to make the question this year something having to do with slavery. Is it right or wrong? And Thomas Clarkson, as a student planning to go into the clergy, enters the contest. He's a particularly diligent student who figures, I'm not just going to make stuff up. I'm going to go out. I'm going to gather evidence. I'm going to go down to Bristol and see if I can find some slave ship crew members and talk to them. And he does an incredible job of rustling up evidence and writes an incredibly compelling essay. It's online. You can read it today. And he argues that slavery is a stain upon the British nation and it must be extinguished. He wins first prize. And then shortly thereafter, as he's going home on horseback to his little village of Wisbech outside of Cambridge, there is an obelisk to this day marking this very spot where this very important moment happened. He gets off of his horse. He's in anguish as he thinks about all that he had discovered and what he had written about. And he writes later in his diary that it was at that point, when he got off of his horse and fell to his knees, that he thought to himself, if what I have written is true, someone must see these calamities to an end. And he ends up from that moment forward devoting the next 61 years, the rest of his life. He puts his chosen profession of an Anglican minister aside and says, I'm going to spend every moment of my life getting rid of the slave trade, educating people about its evils, and as soon as we can, ending slavery as well. And that's when he assembles this group around the table at the print shop in London, and he forms the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And for the next 20 years, he recruits Wilberforce. He says, "You must be our man in Parliament." That moment is portrayed in the film. You carry the day there, we'll feed you the evidence. He goes to Josiah Wedgwood. How many have Wedgwood in their homes, you know, the pottery? Wedgwood becomes a great industrialist who enlists in the anti-slavery effort. And Wedgwood is the guy who designs the logo of a kneeling black man in chains with hands in prayer, and around the perimeter of plates and dishes and other things that they put this on, there's the phrase, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And Clarkson devises a sketch of what a slave ship looks like. And a famous sketch you probably have seen in some history books of all these figures lined up and packed like sardines into these slave ships. He wanted to make the case visual to people. He wanted them to see and to sense what this awful institution was. He just didn't want words. He wanted pictures to convey the message too. He travels the countryside. His life is threatened on many occasions. He's beaten up. He's threatened. There are many times when it must have been Providence that kept him alive. There were many forces out to get him. But the great day came, and it's depicted in that wonderful movie, when in 1807, after all these years of fighting to end slavery, Parliament at 4 a.m. in the morning votes to end the slave trade. And you'd think that after all that work, that people like Clarkson and Wilberforce would have said, well, great day, big victory, we're going to take a break. Because all that vote did was end the trade in slaves. It didn't liberate those who'd already been enslaved. That's the next step. They have to free those enslaved. Guess how many more years that takes before they win? 26 more years. So you're talking 46 years from the day they started until they achieved their ultimate objective. And when that happened in 1833, it was indeed one of the greatest days in all of civilization. When slavery was officially ended, it was to end actually 1 year from that date. And there are lots of stories about what the scenes were like in West Indian colonies on the night before those who had been enslaved were to become free people. They often went, in many of these places, to the highest point on these islands where they had labored in plantations, just to be on that high point when the sun came up in the next morning, because it meant a new day in more ways than one. Thomas Clarkson didn't stop there after 46 years. He devoted the remaining 13 years of his life to improving the lot of those who had been enslaved by forming associations and organizations, raising funds and so forth to help people who had been enslaved. You know, the Quakers that I mentioned were among those in the earliest of days who enlisted in his efforts. They were written off at that time as kind of weird. They were on the fringes of British society. The Quaker men had this odd habit of they wouldn't take their hats off in the presence of nobility if they could get away with it, because they thought that offended a higher authority. But in a wonderful book just published a few years ago called Breaking the Chains, historian Adam Hochschild explains what happened on the day in 1846 when 86-year-old Thomas Clarkson dies. And then there's this marvelous funeral, one of the biggest crowds London had ever seen, turns out to honor this man who had crusaded so nobly for so long. And many of the sons and the grandsons of the Quakers who first enlisted with him all those many years before were at the funeral, and the Quaker men did something they almost never did. They took off their hats. Wouldn't you like someday to get to the point of you're ready to go to your reward, whatever it may be, and wouldn't you like to be able to look back in your life and say, I did my darndest to never be part of the problem. I did my best to be the best example I could be. I tried my best to instill and inspire in others a sense for what it means to be free and to treat others in the most respectful fashion that free people should. I did all I could and let the chips fall where they may. I think Thomas Clarkson was able to say that, and he was able also to point to some marvelous victories. Here is what one of his biographers Ellen Gibson Wilson, said in her biography of Clarkson, she sums up this man this way. She says, Thomas Clarkson, 1760 to 1846, was almost too good to be true. A courageous, visionary, disciplined, self-sacrificing man, a man who gave a long life almost entirely to the service of people he never met in lands he never saw, because he believed in freedom. What an inspiration. I need to wrap up and say something about some other of these traits here very quickly. Self-reliance. Quick word about that. My favorite example of self-reliance is of a woman named Fanny Crosby. Anybody know who she was? Okay, Fanny Crosby. To this day, she lived from 1820 to 1915, died at the age of 95. To this day, she holds the world's record for having written more lyrics to more songs than anyone else in human history. Almost all of them were hymns, more than 8,000. On any given Sunday across America today, much of the world, there are congregations singing Fanny Crosby hymns. She met more U.S. presidents than any other person, as far as we know, who's ever lived. She met every president either when they were in the White House or thereafter, from John Quincy Adams to Woodrow Wilson. She was that's half of the presidents that we've had. She met them, and she knew a lot of them, 20-some presidents. She knew more than probably any other American. She was so sought after as such a saint in her day. She was the first woman to address the United States Congress. You don't hear about her in the history books today. I wonder why. Maybe you would if her message had been, I need a check. I need bailed out. Give me, but that wasn't her message. Do you know what the most remarkable thing about Fanny Crosby was? She had no recollection of ever having seen a thing. She was completely blind from the age of 6 months. And yet this remarkable woman goes to the Congress and says, whatever the obstacle, whatever the barrier, through self-reliance, through character, you can overcome. She didn't say, cut me a check. You might have read about her if she'd said that. Self-reliance. There was a woman who you might say, gee, how could she be self-reliant, given that kind of a handicap? I'm going to close with optimism, and then we'll leave it at that, because you can go on forever. But optimism, so important, especially now when you look around and you say, wow, are we ever going to win this? Look, the world seems to be going mad. And there are lots of people I run into all the time who are believers in liberty, but they've kind of given up. But they think, oh, we can't overcome all of this. So we're going in the wrong direction too fast. And I immediately want to say, wait a minute. I can think of plenty of times in history when the odds and the obstacles must have seemed overwhelming. And yet good people who persevered ultimately prevailed. They didn't give up. Well, how would you like to have lived in 1942? That was a pretty dark year for the world, for liberty, with dictatorships in Europe and Asia on the march, the world embroiled in conflict and bloodshed. How would you have liked to have been at that print shop table in 1787 when 12 people said we're going to change the conscience of an entire empire? Pretty tall order. You've got to be optimistic. Pessimism is self-fulfilling. Pessimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think that you're not going to win, that the good ideas you believe in can't prevail or won't prevail, well, you're not going to work very hard for them. And you're not going to attract other people to them. Because people want to sign on to a winner. They want to know that. Could you get up in front of an audience and inspire them by saying, we got some really good ideas, but I don't think we're going to win them. Will you sign up? People would say, what? You mean sign up for a hopeless cause? Are you kidding? You've got to maintain an optimism. Now, I admit for me it's very easy to come by. I don't know why, but I have always been a kind of pathological optimist. Just kind of naturally seeing that the glass is half full. And I've had staff members at the organizations I've been with who've often kind of tempered me and say, Larry, it's not, your optimism may be a little bit off the charts here. But I'll give you an example of when I discovered that my optimism may be so deeply ingrained as to be pathological. It was in February of 1980. I was driving to work at Northwood University on a very slippery, icy morning in Midland, Michigan. And there was a car coming in the other direction, and he wanted to make a left, but had stopped waiting for me to come through. But at the last second, he decided he had time, for some reason or other, to turn anyway, turned right in front of me. I swerved to miss him and lost control of the car because of the ice, rolled the car upside down in the ravine along the road there, completely upside down. The window on my side was broken out. And I remember vividly what went through my mind and how I felt as the car was rolling upside down. And I've analyzed this because I've thought, that is not normal. But I remember I was completely calm about it. I wasn't bothered in the slightest. It was almost like it was this is kind of fun. But what went through my mind vividly was, I'm going to get a new car out of this. And I did. And I thought, well, that was an innate natural optimism, I think. But optimism that was the secret to Ronald Reagan. You know, he had a great optimism. He thought, you give people the chance, you give them the freedom to try, they'll accomplish things you could never predict. And we can make progress. And one person can make a difference. Look at people like Nicky Winton, one man. Made a huge difference in saving so many lives. So you must believe you can make a difference. You must believe the world can be a better place. That we are creatures of our free will and we can change history if we change minds. And you will not do that, however, if you convey the message to people that ours is a losing cause. It is a winning cause because it is the right cause. Sign up, put a smile on your face, and go to work. Thank you for being so attentive and for being here this week. We deeply appreciate it and hope you'll stay in touch. And I'll watch for your Facebook invite. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a little time for questions. Yes, sir.
Sir, would you be inclined to agree with General John Stark when he took the optimistic outlook towards the Iraq War when he said, live free or die, death is not the worst option?
The question is, would I agree with, I'm not sure who it was, who said, death is not an option, live free or die? What was the other part?
It's live free or die, death is not the worst option from General John Stark about the Iraq War.
Death is not the worst option. Well, I'm not a fan of the Iraq War, but I am a fan of that sentiment. Yes. Death is not the worst option. You know what the worst option to me is? Is to die an unexamined and unfulfilled life, having created problems for other people all your life. That would be a terrible thing, to come to the point where you realize, gee, I'm not sure the world was better because I was here. I think that's a terrible option. I'd want to go to my reward again saying, I did all that I could, even with all the shortcomings I had. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes.
I'd like to hear your insights on a specific dilemma of sort of free market libertarian interest that lots of people I know have struggled with, which is, do you think it speaks badly of a person's character if he accepts government handouts?
Good question. Do I think it speaks badly of a person if he accepts government handouts? I'm the first to admit that government intervention puts lots of people in very difficult circumstances. And so I'm a little bit reluctant to judge someone on this issue and say, you know, bad for you, you should not have taken that handout. What I don't know is, for instance, maybe they're in a terrible situation where they feel they have to do so because of something government's done to them. Even then, I don't think anyone should ever take a penny from the government with a smile on their face. I think they should realize, you know, maybe I'm in a desperate situation created by government itself, and maybe I'm getting a bit of a refund of my own money back. But I'm not going to do so joyfully because I'm still part of an immoral process. So I hesitate to say categorically, no, if you ever take a nickel, you're bad. But I would like someone who does take something from government to say, I'm going to at least try to educate people why we should never get ourselves, we shouldn't have gotten ourselves in a position where we feel we have to do this. So it's a little bit of a gray area in my book. Some people might be more categorical than me, but I realize people sometimes are in circumstances where they feel they have no other option, and it's because of government in some cases. Yes, sir.
Would you agree with Benjamin Rush when he explains, like in many different quotes, how sound religion or Christianity is needed for a free society?
Now this is I'm giving you a personal response here, okay? I'm not being judgmental about anyone's faith or lack thereof. But in my case, yes, I think, what is that? Huh? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Whatever that dentist drill sound is, could you see if we could stop that? The question is, do I think Christianity is, how would you word that again? I'm sorry.
Needed for a free society.
Needed for a free society.
In his quotes, he says religion, but he was referring to
To
Christianity.
Christianity. Well, I certainly wouldn't say that if you're of a different faith then you can't be a good person or supportive of liberty, but I think Christianity, true Christianity, mandates a free and responsible society. And I know a lot of people who think, well, Christianity, that means sharing. We all share. Isn't that's what the welfare state's all about? And when I hear that, I say, wait a minute. Luke 12:13 through 15. You've got a man who comes up to Christ and he says, Master, speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me. In other words, redistribute the wealth. I need, take from that guy and give it to me. Christ had a first-hand opportunity to do a little redistribution. But you know what he says? He says, man, who made me a judge or divider over you? Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's wealth doesn't consist in the material abundance he possesses. The 8th and 10th commandments, and there are counterparts to these in most religions, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not steal. Did you notice there's a period at the end of each of those? It doesn't say thou shalt not steal unless you really need it, or thou shalt not steal unless you're convinced you could spend it better than the guy who earned it. Or thou shalt not steal unless you hire a politician to do it for you. It's pretty emphatic. And I think there's the essence of Christ's teaching is self-renewal. It's not that someone else will make you a better person. It starts with you. And I just think Christianity has given us such a powerful foundation for liberty. Too many people are obviously squandering it.
I was just going to say, in comment to that, also you have an Acts where it talks about how the people lived as though their property was common, and it wasn't a government-imposed thing, it was a private community
That's
of
right.
believers who came together, and nobody thought of their possessions as their own anymore. They
That's
all
right.
freely gave, and I think when you do go into a solid church that believes in that, you see that same thing. I know that the church we go to back home, you see that same idea where people are just givers because that's what they believe is the right thing to do.
That's right.
You don't need the government to get you to become a giver. You're a giver because you believe that's the right thing.
Exactly, yeah. Christ wanted people to do the right thing because they wanted to, not because they had to. And you're absolutely right. There was no coercion involved in that. There was no call for civil government to throw people in jail if they didn't comply. It was purely a voluntary, this is what Christians do of their own free will, not something the state should compel. Jason?
One more follow-up on that. I know in 2 Corinthians 9:7, I think Paul says, give what you purpose in your heart, but don't give out of necessity or coercion because God loves the children.
Yeah, there are lots of places where I don't think the Bible's inconsistent on that at all. Yes, sir?
Well, a lot of libertarian ideas are separating a lot of parts from the government to allow the government to be smaller and not have the government uphold so many things that it doesn't need to. So we're getting to this topic of religion. Shouldn't maybe the religion be separate from the government and not necessarily like we have, in God we trust on our money? Shouldn't maybe we necessarily get rid of the ideal that our government is based upon this and that people's character should just be good and not like try to force that kind of character on people?
Yeah, I think the question is, shouldn't we separate church and state in so many words? We should not have an established church, established by government. We should not, the government should not subsidize religion. Anything government subsidizes, inevitably corrupts. You see that in the when Constantine legalized Christianity, he didn't just allow Christians to practice openly, he also put them on the public dole. And the result was that although the Roman Empire became an officially Christian one, that didn't stave off its decline and collapse because the church was corrupted by much of this. And so, no, I really think civil government should be separate from that because I don't want faith to be a matter that politicians meddle with. Yeah. I want to get to a different hand. I'm sorry. Jason.
In a market economy, do you consider selfishness a bad characteristic?
Is selfishness a bad characteristic in the American economy?
In a market economy.
In a market economy, you say? Market economy. No. In selfishness, if you define that as being... well, I'll tell you how I described, when I taught economics, how I described or defined competition. I told the students competition is striving for excellence in the service of others for self-benefit. Okay? For selfish reasons. In a market economy, you can be the most selfish person in the world, and really, if you carry that to an extreme, that's a matter between you and your maker, as long as you don't use force or employ government to use force to satisfy your selfishness. But in a market economy, you can't just want something and demand it and get it. You can't put a crown on your head and wrap a robe around yourself and say to people, cough it up, I'm the queen. I mean, you have to produce. You have to offer something that others say, yeah, I'll take that. And you may get rich in the process and thereby satisfy your selfishness, but in a market economy, you can't do that unless you've satisfied other people. So is it possible for a person to be so self-absorbed that he's blinded by other aspects of life? Yes. I don't know that that's something you can legislate against unless it crosses the line and becomes fraud or theft. But these are largely personal matters. And no system that professes to diminish or abolish selfishness or greed has ever been successful in doing so. All it does is take it from people freely participating in the market and satisfying their selfishness by service to others, and transfers it to government bureaucrats who satisfy their selfishness by bludgeoning other people with the force of government. So I don't think you can do away with it. The big question is, what's the best way to channel selfishness into the most constructive directions? That's a market economy, where you get rewarded if you serve others, if you provide something of value that people will buy and buy repeatedly. So, no, I would agree with Ayn Rand in that sense. Selfishness is a virtue, although I concede that it can become extreme, but that's, unless it crosses that line and becomes fraud or force, it's a matter between you and your maker. Next.
Can
Yes.
you just give the name of the movie, the guy who did the kids out of...
Yes, the documentary is called The Power of Good. And I'm not sure if you can get it online. We have a supply of it here. But I only hesitate because I know we don't have enough to give everybody. If you have trouble finding it online, just drop me an email. And there's a foundation in Michigan that is interested in distributing it. I think I can get a lot of copies. But see if you can find it online, and we might be able to get it to you at nominal cost. It's just 1 hour, but it's remarkable. It really is very moving. You'll have a tear in your eye when it's done. Yeah.
I guess you kind of answered this question yesterday, but who in, I guess, modern, I mean, they don't have to be in Congress, but modern politics do you admire, or public policy maybe?
Who do I admire in modern politics? Well, first of all, I don't look to politics too often, so I'm...
In modern
yeah.
society.
Ron Paul, I have to say, is a man of principle, as much as it gets in public life. I mean, he tells everybody, here's where I stand, and I'm consistent, I'm for liberty. If you don't like it, vote for the other guy. He doesn't feel as though he has to cut corners and prevaricate and buy off this or that group in order to stay in office. That was another characteristic of Grover Cleveland. He didn't care whether you elected him or not. He had other things he could do. So that's why he thought, I'm going to tell you where I stand, you pick. This isn't the only thing I can do. Some of these politicians act like there's nothing they can do if they, and it's probably true, they may otherwise be unemployable if they weren't in government. But so Ron Paul would be one. Although flawed, there was an awful lot about Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that I greatly admired. I think of recent leaders anyway, they're among the better ones. Yes?
But kind of on the Ron Paul one, like maybe like people didn't understand Ron Paul because maybe he just made too much sense. Like maybe like libertarian ideas are just like, could it be that libertarian ideas are just too simple?
Well, that's a good question because they are. When you present them well, most people react positively. They say, "Well, yeah, this is common sense." I love Ron to death, and I know him very well, but I think he'd be the first to say that he isn't necessarily the most articulate defender. And I hesitate to even say that because, like I say, I'm a man of great principle. But where we have to get better as a movement and as individuals is in learning what are the sound bites that make a light go on, that make people say, hey, I want to know more about that. I want to read about that. What do you recommend? Ron could do better in that area to sort of win people over a little bit. He's great at preaching to the choir. And he did win over a lot of non-choir people. But I think even he would say he could do better at articulating a message that newcomers find compelling, and we can win them over. That's where we need to work. Coming up with a rhetorical flourish, the turn of the phrase, the stories, the analogies that make people say, wow, I'm on fire, let me learn more. Yes, sir.
A quick practical question about like supporting Ron Paul and whatnot. Do you think we in our political activism should focus on like reaching towards like people in the Republican Party by like more or less modifying that platform, or go with a third party, like actual Libertarian Party platform?
Should people of our persuasion go with third parties or try to revive one of the major ones, the Republican Party? That's a political question I kind of want to shy away from. Realistically, I have to say, though, that third parties are extraordinarily difficult, and the two parties have made them difficult to succeed. So it might be best to try to just spread these ideas to whatever willing audience you can find. They'll tend to be maybe people who will work more in one party over another, but let that happen of its own accord. Focus instead on the ideas. We don't need more political activists so much as we need more educators who might motivate the political activists in the right direction. But it's the education side that we need. With that, I think our time is up. I want to say, one more? Okay, I thought you had signaled that was it. Well, let me just close with one final little story that I hope you can take away and be inspired by. True story, goes back to 1986. It's from a personal experience. I spent time in the 80s and early 90s behind the Iron Curtain in a number of countries, helping and making contact with resistance elements. So inspired so many times by people who put their lives on the line on behalf of liberty. And in 1986, I went to Poland in the midst of that long, dark night of communist tyranny and martial law from December of 81 till 1989, 20 years ago yesterday. Poland had descended into total dictatorship again, and private free market-oriented movements had been outlawed. Well, in the midst of that period, I got into Poland and spent time in a different home every night with people who were active in the resistance. And one night, there was a group of underground printers who wanted to impress upon me what they had done. I have samples now of the stuff that they did. These were people who were illegally translating great works from the West in liberty, even Rothbard, Mises, Hayek, translating it into Polish, printing it illegally and distributing this stuff around the country. And they brought out stacks of this stuff. They wanted to impress upon me what they were doing. I asked at one point, where do you guys get all the paper? The government owns all the printing presses. Where do you get all the paper to do this? And a young man named Pavel answered and said, well, we get it from two places. One, we smuggle it in from the West. And two, we steal it from communists. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, the government's got its factories making its propaganda and their newspapers and so forth, but most of the workers at a lot of those places think like we do. And we have enough of those contacts, they smuggle the paper out, and even in a few occasions, they've actually printed our stuff on the government's own printing presses. And then the most moving moment, though, and this is my final story, was one night I was told by my escorts, we're taking you to the home of a very special couple. Their names are Zbigniew and Sofia Romaszewski. Never heard of them before that time. And here they had run underground radio for Solidarity during the first 6 months of martial law, from December 81 to the middle of 82. When martial law was declared and the government put the troops and tanks in the streets, this couple went underground broadcasting a message of liberty for Poland on behalf of the banned organization called Solidarity. And they had been detected and arrested. He was given 4 years in prison. She was given 3. They were kept in solitary confinement apart from each other for most of that time. He was beaten on many occasions. They were not out of jail all that long when I was there in their apartment in November of 1986. And, of course, I wanted to know, well, what are you doing now? Well, they were so eager to tell me, we're active again. We're doing stuff with the underground. We're helping distribute literature, what have you. And we spent an evening talking about all this. And at one point I said, when you were broadcasting, before you were arrested, how did you know if people were listening? And Sophia answered, and she said, well, we wondered that too, because we could only broadcast 8 or 10 minutes at a time. Then we had to go off the air, or they could trace us. And they ultimately did and arrested them. So we broadcast for 8 or 10 minutes, and then we'd leave and go someplace else to try to stay a step ahead of the government. And one night we were broadcasting, she said, we asked people on the air, if you believe in liberty for Poland, give us some idea of who we're talking to, how many are of the same view. She said, please blink your lights and call your friends and ask them who may believe in the same things, ask them to do the same. And she said, we then went to the window, and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. And would you believe, in that wonderful round of free elections 20 years ago yesterday, Zbigniew Romaszewski won a seat in the lower house of parliament. And now, 20 years later, he is a member of the Polish Senate. And he has a website. And Poland is free today, in part because of the perseverance of people like them. So you are blinking lights. Never let your light go out on behalf of liberty. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support of FEE and of liberty.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you everyone for coming this week. Don't forget to turn in your evaluations and your name tag and your thank you letter up at the registration table. And if you haven't had your headshot taken, we'll also take care of that at the registration table. Please let us know if there's anything you need. Those who are staying the weekend will drive you to the hotel. Thanks again for coming.